My name is Sarah Miller, and I learned that some lies come disguised as reassurance on a cold February morning when my phone buzzed with a message that would haunt me for months. I was at Fort Carson, finishing my third week of advanced tactical training, when my sister Emma's text popped up on my screen. Grandpa's fine. Just a fever. Nothing to worry about. Simple. Clean. The kind of message designed to end a conversation before it starts. But something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was the way she wrote fine, like she was trying to convince herself. Or maybe it was the fact that Grandpa had never been just anything in his 78 years. He was the man who taught me to tie my boots before I could spell my name, who sat through every single one of my high school basketball games, and who wrote me letters every week since I enlisted 3 years ago. For you to continue listening to this beautiful and special story, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from so I can include a special greeting for you in an upcoming story. I stared at that text for longer than I should have, sitting in my bunk while my fellow soldiers prepared for evening chow. Something in my chest tightened, not the kind of tension you feel before a mission, but the kind that comes when your instincts are screaming and everyone around you is acting like everything's normal. "You coming, Miller?" Sergeant Rodriguez called from the doorway. "Yeah, just a second," I replied, but I was already scrolling through my contacts, looking for someone else in the family who might tell me the truth. The problem was, Emma had always been the family communicator. She was the one who organized holiday dinners, remembered birthdays, and apparently managed family health crises. I tried calling my cousin Jake in Topeka, but it went straight to voicemail. Same with my Aunt Linda. It was like the entire family had suddenly become unreachable, all at the exact moment when Grandpa was supposedly fine. That night, I lay in my narrow military cot, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the last time I'd seen him. It was Christmas, just 2 months ago. He'd seemed tired, maybe a little thinner than usual, but he'd still insisted on carving the turkey and telling his stories about working the wheat fields in the 1960s. He'd pulled me aside before I left and said, "Sarah, you take care of yourself out there. Don't let them change who you are." I should have stayed longer. I should have asked more questions. Chapter 2. The decision to go home. By Thursday morning, I couldn't concentrate on anything. During weapons training, I missed targets I could hit blindfold. During tactical exercises, I found myself checking my phone every few minutes, hoping for an update that never came. "Miller, what's your malfunction?" Drill Sergeant Hayes barked after I fumbled a basic maneuver for the third time. "Nothing, Sergeant. Won't happen again." But it did happen again, because my mind wasn't in Colorado. It was in Kansas, in a small house on Elm Street, where an old man might be sicker than anyone was willing to admit. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. I requested emergency leave. Captain Morrison looked up from his paperwork when I knocked on his office door. "What can I do for you, Miller?" "Sir, I need to request emergency leave. Family medical situation." He studied my face for a moment. "How serious?" The honest answer was that I didn't know, and that's exactly what scared me. "I'm not sure, sir. That's why I need to go." He approved it without another question. Maybe he saw something in my expression that reminded him of his own family. Or maybe he just understood that sometimes you have to trust your gut even when you can't explain why. I caught a red-eye flight from Colorado Springs to Wichita, spending 6 hours in an uncomfortable middle seat, replaying every conversation I'd had with Grandpa over the past few months. Had he mentioned feeling unwell? Had I been too busy with training to really listen? The flight attendant offered me peanuts and a drink, but my stomach was too knotted to accept anything. Instead, I stared out the small window at the darkness below, and tried to prepare myself for whatever I was going to find. Chapter 3. Arriving to silence. I landed in Wichita at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning that felt more like the middle of winter than early February. The rental car smelled like artificial pine and cigarettes, but I barely noticed as I drove through the familiar streets of my hometown. Everything looked exactly the same. The same gas stations, the same churches, the same billboards advertising local car dealerships. But something felt different. Maybe it was me. Maybe 3 years in the military changes how you see the place you grew up. Makes you notice things that were always there but never seemed important. I drove past the high school, where I'd played basketball, past the diner where Grandpa used to take me for chocolate chip pancakes on Sunday mornings, past the library where he'd sit with me for hours while I worked on school projects. Each familiar landmark felt like a memory I was afraid I might be losing. When I pulled into his driveway, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. No lights on inside. No car in the garage. No newspaper on the front porch. It looked like a house where nobody lived anymore. I used my key, the same one he'd given me when I turned 16, and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like windows that hadn't been opened in weeks. Mail was piled on the kitchen counter. Unopened bills and advertisements creating a small mountain of neglect. The refrigerator hummed in the silence, and when I opened it, I found milk that had expired 10 days ago, and sandwich meat that looked like it belonged in a science experiment. Just a fever, I whispered to the empty kitchen. Right. I called Emma's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Same with my parents, who were supposedly visiting my uncle in Phoenix. Everyone in my family had suddenly become impossible to reach, which either meant they were all dealing with some kind of emergency, or they were all avoiding something they didn't want to explain. Chapter 4. The Hospital Search. I spent the next hour calling every hospital in a 50-mile radius, starting with the obvious ones and working my way down to smaller clinics and urgent care centers. It's amazing how helpful people become when you mention you're active military looking for your grandfather. Robert Miller, the receptionist at Wichita General, asked. Let me check our system. There was a pause, some typing. Then yes, he was admitted Wednesday evening. He's currently in our intensive care unit. The words hit me like a physical blow. ICU, not observation, or regular care, or any of the dozen euphemisms hospitals use to make serious situations sound manageable. Intensive care unit. Can you tell me his condition? I'm sorry. I can only release that information to immediate family members. I am immediate family. I'm his granddaughter, Sarah Miller. I just flew in from Colorado. Another pause. More typing. It looks like your sister Emma Miller is listed as his primary emergency contact. You'll need to speak with her, or come in person with proper identification. I wanted to explain that Emma was apparently in Miami posting emoji responses to family medical emergencies, but instead I said, I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to the hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept thinking about that text, just a fever, and wondering how many other lies I'd been told without realizing it. How long had he been sick? How long had everyone known except me? When I walked into the hospital lobby, the smell of disinfectant and floor wax hit me immediately. It's a smell you never forget once you've spent time in military medical facilities, a combination of cleanliness and desperation that seems to live in the walls of every place where people fight to stay alive. Chapter 5. Room 304. The ICU receptionist was a middle-aged woman, with kind eyes and the sort of gentle voice that hospital staff develop after years of delivering difficult news to worried families. I need to see Robert Miller, I said, showing her my military ID and driver's license. I'm his granddaughter. She looked at her computer screen, then back at me. Room 304. But I should prepare you. He's been unconscious since Thursday morning. The doctors are doing everything they can. Unconscious since Thursday, the same day Emma had texted me that he was fine. I walked down the hallway with legs that felt like they were made of concrete. Room 304 was at the end of the corridor, past a dozen other rooms where other families were dealing with their own crises. I could hear muffled conversations, the sound of medical equipment, the occasional sob from behind a partially closed door. When I reached his room, I stopped in the doorway and felt something inside my chest break apart. He looked so small in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed and kept track of every breath, every heartbeat, every vital sign that was keeping him alive. Tubes ran from his nose, his arms, his chest. His hands, which had always been strong and steady from decades of farm work, were bruised purple from IV needles. But the worst part wasn't the tubes or the machines, or even how fragile he looked. The worst part was that he was completely alone. No flowers on the bedside table, no cards from well-wishers, no family members holding his hand or reading him stories or just sitting quietly so he wouldn't have to be unconscious in a room full of strangers. I sat down in the chair next to his bed, and took his hand carefully, avoiding the IV line that disappeared under medical tape. His skin felt paper-thin and cold. Hi, Grandpa, I whispered. It's Sarah. I'm here now. Chapter 6. The Nurse's Story. A nurse came in about an hour later, a young woman with braided hair and scrubs covered in cartoon cat. She moved around his bed with practiced efficiency, checking monitors and adjusting tubes with the kind of gentle confidence that comes from doing something difficult every day. Are you family? She asked. His granddaughter. I just got here from Colorado. She nodded, making notes on a clipboard. I'm Jessica. I've been his primary nurse since he was admitted Wednesday night. Wednesday night, I looked at her carefully. Not Thursday morning. No, definitely Wednesday. The paramedics brought him in around He'd been found by a neighbor who hadn't seen him pick up his mail for a few days. She paused, studying my expression. Has no one been in to see him? The question hung in the air between us like an accusation. I was told he just had a fever, that it wasn't serious. Jessica's expression changed, softening with something that looked like sympathy mixed with professional frustration. A fever. She looked down at her clipboard, then back at me. Honey, your grandfather came in with pneumonia, dehydration, and signs that he'd been sick for at least a week. He was unconscious when they brought him in. I felt like someone had just explained that the sky wasn't actually blue, that everything I'd been told about reality was wrong. A week? Maybe longer. The doctor said it looked like he'd been trying to take care of himself at home for quite a while before things got serious. She adjusted one of his blankets, her voice gentle but clear. This wasn't sudden. This was someone who needed help and didn't get it in time. I stared at Grandpa's face, trying to process what she was telling me. He'd been sick for a week, maybe longer, and somehow my entire family had decided that the appropriate response was to tell me he had just a fever and then disappear to Miami. Has anyone else been here to see him? I asked, though I already knew the answer. You're the first visitor he's had. Chapter 7. The phone calls home. I stepped outside to the hospital parking lot and called Emma again. This time she answered on the second ring, and I could hear music and laughter in the background. Oh hey Sarah. What's up? What's up? I repeated, trying to keep my voice level. I'm standing outside the ICU where Grandpa has been unconscious for 3 days, and you want to know what's up? The music in the background got quieter, like she'd moved away from whatever party she was at. Wait, what? You're at the hospital? Yes, I'm at the hospital where Grandpa has been since Wednesday night with pneumonia and dehydration, not the just a fever you told me about. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, become defensive. Look, Sarah, I know you're upset, but this isn't my fault. Mom and Dad are in Phoenix and I had this trip planned for months. I can't just drop everything every time something happens. Every time something happened, I could feel my military training kicking in. The discipline that keeps you calm when everything around you is chaos. Emma, he's unconscious. He's been alone in intensive care for 3 days. Well, you're there now, right? So it's handled. It's handled. Like Grandpa was a problem that needed to be managed rather than a person who'd spent his entire life taking care of everyone around him. Why didn't you tell me how serious it was? Another pause. Because I knew you'd do exactly what you did. Drop everything and come run. You're in the middle of important training, Sarah. Your career matters. I looked back at the hospital building, at the window that I thought might be his room. My career matters more than his life? That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. I hung up and immediately called my parents. My father answered, and I could hear the sound of a golf course in the background. Sarah, how's training going? Dad, I'm at the hospital with Grandpa. Why didn't anyone tell me how sick he was? The golf course sound stopped abruptly. Hospital? What hospital? Emma said he just had a little cold. Chapter 8. The long night. I spent that night in room 304, sleeping in the chair next to his bed and waking up every time one of his machines beeped or a nurse came in to check on him. The hospital at night is a different place than during the day, quieter, but also more intense. Every sound seems amplified, every breath more precious. Around 3 a.m. I found myself talking to him even though he couldn't hear me. I told him about basic training, about the friends I'd made, about the places I'd been stationed. I told him about the letters he'd sent me, how I'd read them over and over when I was homesick, or scared, or just needed to remember where I came from. You always signed them love, Grandpa, I said to his sleeping face. Never just Grandpa or love, always both. Like you wanted to make sure I knew exactly how you felt. A nurse came in around 4 a.m. Not Jessica, but an older woman with gray hair and tired eyes, who moved like she'd been doing this job for decades. You don't have to stay here all night, honey, she said gently. We'll call you if anything changes. He shouldn't be alone, I replied. She looked at him, then at me, and something in her expression softened. You're military, aren't you? I nodded. My son's in the Navy, I understand. She checked his IV bag, made a note on his chart. Your grandfather's lucky to have you. But that was the thing. I wasn't sure he was lucky to have me. I was just the one who showed up. The one who couldn't ignore her instincts when something felt wrong. The rest of his family, the people who lived in the same state and could have been there in an hour, had chosen Miami beaches and Phoenix golf courses over sitting in an uncomfortable chair next to someone who'd loved them unconditionally their entire lives. Chapter 9. Morning Conversations. Patterson came in around 7 a.m., a tall man with graying hair and the kind of serious expression that doctors develop when they've had to deliver bad news too many times. "You must be Sarah," he said, extending his hand. "Your grandfather has mentioned you many times. He's been off and on yesterday evening, mostly confused and disoriented. But when I asked if there was anyone he wanted us to call, he kept saying Sarah in Colorado. We tried to reach you through the contact information we had, but the numbers were outdated." I thought about Emma, who was supposed to be his emergency contact, who was probably still sleeping off whatever party she'd been at when I called her last night. "What's his condition?" Patterson pulled up a chair, and I appreciated that he sat down rather than looming over me with medical authority. "He's stable, but weak. The pneumonia responded well to antibiotics, and we've got his hydration levels back to normal. The main concern now is his overall strength. This kind of illness is hard on someone his age, especially when it goes untreated for as long as his did." "How long was he sick before someone found him?" "Based on what we can determine, probably 7 to 10 days. Long enough that he'd stopped eating regularly, wasn't drinking enough fluids, wasn't taking care of himself the way he needed to." The doctor's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the judgment underneath. "Do you mind me asking where the rest of his family is?" It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a good answer for. "They're around. I live the farthest away, but I'm the one who came." He nodded like he'd heard similar stories before. "That happens more often than you'd think. Sometimes the people who care most are the ones who have to travel the farthest." Around 10 a.m., Grandpa's eyes opened for the first time since I'd arrived. He looked confused at first, blinking slowly and trying to focus on the ceiling. When he turned his head and saw me, his expression changed to something I couldn't quite identify: surprise, relief, maybe a little embarrassment. "Sarah," his voice was barely a whisper, rough from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "I'm here, Grandpa. I'm right here." He tried to sit up, but I gently pressed his shoulder back against the pillow. "Just rest. You're in the hospital, but you're going to be okay." "How long have you been here?" "Since yesterday morning. I came as soon as I could." He closed his eyes, and for a moment I thought he'd fallen back asleep. Then he said, "You didn't have to come all this way. I know you're busy with important things." Important things. Like everyone in my family had decided that my life was somehow more important than his, that my training and career and whatever else I was doing was worth more than sitting next to him when he was scared and sick and alone. "There's nothing more important than this," I said, and I meant. Chapter 10. The letter I should have written. 3 days later, I was sitting in the same chair, watching Grandpa eat actual food for the first time since I'd arrived. Jello and broth and tiny spoonfuls of applesauce that the nurse said would help him regain his strength gradually. My parents had driven up from Phoenix the day before, full of apologies and explanations about mixed signals and miscommunication. Emma had sent a text saying she'd try to visit when she got back from Miami, but only if he's really better because hospitals make me anxious. I'd used my laptop to write letters to my commanding officers, explaining why I needed to extend my emergency leave. I'd called my roommate at Fort Carson to ask her to water the plant on my windowsill. I'd made arrangements to stay in Kansas for another week, maybe 2, until Grandpa was strong enough to go home and we could figure out what kind of help he needed. But the letter I really needed to write was the one I'd been avoiding. That afternoon, while Grandpa napped, I found myself in the hospital cafeteria with a piece of paper and a pen, trying to find words for something I'd never had to say before. "Dear family," I wrote, then crossed it out. Too formal. "To everyone who should have been here," I wrote, then crossed that out too. Too angry. Finally, I just started writing what I felt. When I was 17 and decided to enlist, Grandpa pulled me aside and said, "Sarah, the military will teach you about duty and honor and service, but don't let it teach you to forget about love." I didn't understand what he meant then. I understand now. Love isn't just the easy emotions, the birthday cards and holiday hugs and family photos where everyone's smiling. Love is showing up when it's inconvenient. Love is sitting in an uncomfortable chair for 3 days because someone you care about shouldn't have to be afraid alone. Love is making phone calls you don't want to make and having conversations that reveal things you wish you didn't know about the people you're supposed to trust. For 3 years, I've been learning how to serve my country, how to be responsible for people I might never see again, how to make decisions that could save lives or cost them. But this week, I learned something else. I learned that the most important service isn't always the one you volunteer for. Sometimes it's just being the person who shows up when everyone else has found something more important to do. Grandpa is going to be fine. He's strong and stubborn, and the doctors say he should make a full recovery, but he'll never forget who was here and who wasn't, and neither will I. I folded the letter without signing it, then tore it up and threw it away. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be true. Some disappointments don't need to be shared to be understood. When I walked back into room 304, Grandpa was awake, looking out the window at the Kansas sky that had always been part of our shared landscape. You know, he said without turning away from the window, I wrote you a letter every week for 3 years, but I never told you the most important thing. What's that? He turned to look at me, and his eyes were clearer than they'd been since I arrived. I told you I was proud of you for serving your country, but I'm prouder of you for coming home when your family needed you even when they didn't know how to ask. I took his hand, careful as always of the IV line, and felt something settle into place that had been broken for days, maybe long. That's what you do for people you love, Grandpa. You show up. He squeezed my fingers with strength that surprised me. Yes, he said quietly, that's exactly what you do. Outside his window, the Kansas sky stretched endless and blue, the same sky we'd shared for 18 years before I left for Colorado, the same sky that would be there long after both of us were gone. But right then, in that moment, it felt like the most beautiful thing in the world was simply being there together, two people who understood that love isn't complicated at all. It's just showing up.